Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we are back in War Thunder and we're going to be looking at another French aircraft. This is the C.R.714 and I did do a devlog on it, so we are going to be skipping the historic portion of this review. As you can see, it doesn't have any armor on it, not even on the front, but if we look at the X-ray, you'll find that it has an absolutely massive engine in the front, a Renault 12 R03, which is actually different to a lot of the other aircraft which run the Hispano-Suzas or the Gnome Rones. It is also equipped with 4 7.5mm machine guns, as you can see here, 2 in each wing, and has an absolutely huge fuel tank in front of the pilot, which means that you can run this thing for over an hour if you feel like it. Generally not a great idea, unless you want to be heavy as hell. Has an oil cooling system at the bottom, which is in the form of this big old hole radiator here. And overall, it's an interesting machine. Looking at the modifications, generally for this aircraft, I would say go for flight performance. The guns themselves, it's very easy to get the offensive 7mm, but then you don't really need the new 7mm MGs. It's better to work on these here, the engine injection compressor, and so on. The default belts for the 7.5mm are absolutely abysmal, but at 1.7 you'll be running into a lot of aircraft which don't have a lot of armor on them or anything like that, so those ball rounds pretty much turn into AP rounds. Therefore you can chop off wings quite easily, and you can go after, planes quite viciously. If you want to set fires and attack in that way, then you're going to have to run the universal or the stealth. I prefer stealth on this machine, just because at this moment in time I'm comfortable with where I know where the shots are going. But if you are struggling with that, I would go for universal. The tracer belts, which used to be my favourite, seem to not be working as well, and with 1200 rounds at this lower level, you want to try and make every shot count, especially since these are high fire rate guns on them in these little, I suppose you'd call them pseudopods, to be quite honest. But anyway, skipping the historical section, let's get into some gameplay. So even though the C.R.714 was based on a race aircraft, what you will realize if you decide to spade this thing from stock, it is quite heavy, to be honest. And by that I mean, it's very hard to get up to altitude, it feels like it doesn't have enough engine power, and at the same time, what it also means it has an incredibly good dive. When I talked about the VG-33, I talked about how impressive its dive was, but also how impressive its climb was, and that was a big factor onto why you could get into positions which were very advantageous for you. Now, unfortunately, with the CR, where it struggles is getting to that altitude to be effective. Luckily, because you have a BR which is lower than the VG-33 of 1.7, you find that a lot of people don't climb that much, but what you also find is a lot of interesting bombers. So in this map we have the Ju-87, S-81 and H-6K, and if the S-81 and the H-6K stay at altitude, you're going to have a real issue trying to get up to them and trying to be able to actually fight them before they try and get back down to their airfield. If other fighters climb, like at 1.7, you've got to remember that stuff like the HE-100 exists and the early BF-109s, and they can really take you to task, because they can outclimb you, they can outturn you, because everything on the CR-714 depends on its ability to get to speed. And when you're at higher upgrades, when you are fully modded out, this is obviously a lot easier to do. Also, it has one of the nicest opening cockpit things I've seen, which, as you can see there, is just a little slant on the left. And I'm guessing you just kind of wiggle out of it, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, moving back to what I was talking about. With the fact that the CR-714 with upgrades still struggles to get up to altitude and still struggles to get up to speed, you can see how at stock it's going to be incredibly annoying to do. Now sometimes you do get bailed out by the enemy team, basically not climbing and not going up, and therefore even if you're at 1,000 or 1,500 meters, you can sit in a pocket and wait for them to go under you, then you can dive on them and energy fight them and use this plane as it's supposed to be used. But sometimes if the enemy decides that they want to climb and they want to be above you, which is not hard to do because, you know, you have such an abysmal climb race. It can be incredibly hard to win fights in it. Luckily, it does have combat flaps, which is nice, and even though it doesn't have the 20mm in the nose, it is equipped with the 4.7.5s, which are generally good enough at this BR to do anything. 1200 rounds may seem like a lot, but when you start firing, you realize that you're going through rounds incredibly quickly. So therefore, being accurate with these guns is incredibly important, not just because you want to make sure you do as much damage in a specific area as possible, but also because you run out of ammo incredibly quickly. I would liken it to something like a Hurricane. The Hurricane, it has a ridiculous amount of ammo, but at the same time, it has a ridiculous amount of guns. So therefore, you pretty much have to balance it out. Is it better to try and use all of your ammo on one target, get back to the airfield, get back up? Basically, is it better to focus on one key target, or is short bursts better to try and take the enemy out? If you don't take them out on a pass, then you go back up again, and then you just keep recycling. If you've ever flown anything like a HE-100, or the VG-33, or the MC-202, or, you know, the BF-109, even the Hawk, this aircraft is incredibly similar, but just slightly worse. That would be how I describe it. It is definitely not as good as some of those other aircraft, and what is kind of interesting is also the camera placement behind it. I feel like, and now I might be wrong about this, but I feel like the camera is much more behind this aircraft than others, making it a lot smaller than it actually is. The aircraft in itself is incredibly long, and as you can see where the cockpit is situated with its large nose having a fuel tank and an engine in front of you, it's kind of... It just seems like it's not very big because the camera is so far back, even though it's bigger than it seems. The fact it doesn't have armor isn't surprising at rank 1, but what is a worry is if you get a aircraft on your 6, generally you have two moves at this BR. You can either outturn the aircraft, and hopefully it's not a biplane, and if it is a biplane, then you can outrun it. The C.R.714 struggles to outrun things. It takes too long to get to speed. The acceleration just isn't there unless you have altitude. So hopefully, if you put yourself in a position where you have altitude, then at least you have that on your side. But it generally means that if somebody does get on you, especially one of those aircraft I talked before, like a HE-100 or a early BF-109, what's going to happen is you're really just going to die. You can maybe outmaneuver them with combat flaps, but understand that you have about one good turn before the enemy will be able to get you. And it's just one of those unfortunate things that happens when your fighter isn't as good at retaining energy as the enemy fighter. And with the model of this, with the way that the guns are situated in the wings, you can't really blame this aircraft for that. It is kind of flimsy when it comes to taking damage, so even if a fighter doesn't decide to come after you, let's say you are trying to tail a bomber, you've been able to get up to heights and fight it, what happens is you have to be really careful of the turrets of that bomber. Your wings will easily fall off, and because you have such a large center mass, hitting the engine is not hard to do, and because there's no armor on it or no protection, pretty much one or two shots will either knock out oil or water, and your engine will die incredibly quickly. One of the nice things about this Renault engine, though, is that you are actually able to, what would be the word, to WEP pretty much continuously. A general battle at this BR takes about 10, maybe 15 minutes if there's a bomber left, but overall, it will never overheat by the time that you get back to the airfield and rearm. What is kind of interesting in this match is I was going for the S81, but there was two allied fighters on this HE-112, and, well, they crashed into each other in a wonderful fashion. So that basically means that I can show you exactly the perfect position you want to be in the CR714, and also the perfect position for a lot of planes. So you take hits, push to one of the sides, extend and wait to see what the HE112 does. Hopefully you've done enough damage to them so nothing can really happen. You can go straight up because you have more energy than your opponent, and then just before stalling you can straighten out, or at least attempt to straighten out a little bit, trying to bleed them of a bit more speed. Roll over, use the elevator to push around. You can use the rudder as well if you feel like it. I generally feel like I have much more control just using the elevator, and then just go down again. Just keep doing this, standard, energy fighting when it comes to these types of vehicles. I am using stealth, as I said, because I'm confident with these rounds now, but universal would work exactly the same, and default, with a bunch of the AP rounds that it has, it should be completely fine with doing damage to a lot of the aircraft that you run into. Maybe a bit of an issue with some of the bombers you run into, but overall it's okay. And all we have to do is just keep hitting him, and then just keep looping on him, and just do this over and over again. The perfect scenario for a plane like this. You've just got to make sure that you don't run out of ammo, which can definitely happen sometimes. But overall, if you put in that position, the CR714 is going to do well. If the enemy decides to target you and climb higher than you, you're going to die. It's very hard to do anything in that situation. But anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.